Hi, the poem I'm going to recap today is Mametz Wood by Owen. You can see from the three images on the screen, which are also included on the blog, that these images kind of summarise the events and the message in the poem. In the top left-hand corner, we can see Mametz Wood in 1916. In the background, you can see that it's basically been destroyed. The shelling and the attacks and the constant warfare around it have left damage to the land, and obviously we know about the deaths of the soldiers as well. And then here in the bottom picture we see Mametz Wood as it is today, fully recovered. Such a small, surprisingly small wood, I always feel, considering the number of deaths that occurred there. But in the top right hand picture we see a photograph of the uncovered grave that was discovered in 2005, and I think, as you'll see as we analyse the poem, these three pictures summarise the message that Owen is trying to get across. Hopefully we'll come to that at the end. If you studied this poem before, pause the video now and answer the following questions before watching the rest of the video to see if you were right. How does Shears describe the young in this poem? What technique is used to portray the earth, and what's the effect? And how does Shears use time for effect in this poem? Okay, if you're taking notes on this, you might want to use this structure to lay out your notes. It's the structure that I'll be using when I go through the poem quite briefly in the video that's to follow. So I'll give you time now to again pause the video and jot down this structure so that you can take some constructive notes. Okay, the context for the poem. It's written in 2005 after the discovery of a mass grave in Mametz Wood. These soldiers buried in the grave died in 1916, but aren't discovered for 89 years. The Battle of Mametz Wood was part of the much larger Battle of the Somme, and like many of these smaller battles of World War I, it tends to be a little bit forgotten and lost in the enormous casualty figures of the larger conflict, either the Somme or World War I as a whole. It is in fact, of course, a separate battle, but largely unremembered, despite the fact that over 3,000 men died in this battle. Even today in France and Belgium, farmers occasionally uncover these graves, these soldiers who were buried in World War I between 1914 and 1918. In this case, we know they were buried in 1916, as that's when this battle was fought. I think we're seeing the long-term effects of the war. If we think back to the photos on the opening slide, Mametz Wood looks like it's recovered, but actually in the ground underneath there are still the bodies of dead soldiers whose graves are largely forgotten. Okay, let's move on with looking at some of the aspects of the poem. I've given you a copy of the poem here, and there's also a copy on the blog that you can print out or you can look at alongside this video. For years afterwards, the farmers found them, the wasted young, turning up under their plough blades as they tended the land back into itself. A chit of bone, the china plate of a shoulder blade, the relic of a finger, the blown and broken bird's egg of a skull, all mimicked now in flint, breaking blue in white across this field where they were told to walk, not run, towards the wood and its nesting machine guns. And even now the earth stands sentinel, reaching back into itself for reminders of what happened, like a wound working a foreign body to the surface of the skin. This morning, 20 men buried in one long grave, a broken mosaic of bone linked arm in arm, their skeletons paused mid-dance macabre. In boots that outlasted them, their socketed heads tilted back at an angle and their jaws, those that have them, dropped open. As if the notes they had sung have only now, with this unearthing, slipped from their absent tongues. So, the first language point that I want to draw your attention to is this language about injury and death, which emphasises the reality of war, that it is a horrific event, and that people die, and we see these broken bits of bone, the fragility of the human body with a china plate of a shoulder blade, and a relic of a finger, and a skull looking like a broken bird's egg, again emphasising that fragility. And then in the bottom half of the poem we find 20 men buried in one long grave, their bones just a mosaic now, all broken together, skeletons and socketed heads, and their jaws with the rider, those that have them, suggesting that some of them do not even have jaws, and obviously absent tongues, reminding us of the fact that these are just bones. So this language is very, very focused on the death and injury of these men, with the word relic suggesting that these are precious, that there's something to be treasured, even though the war had horrific effects. The second language point I'd make is the fact that the earth is personified here. The earth stands sentinel. It's as if the earth is guarding these dead bodies. A sentinel is like a guard of honour. And it's like the earth itself is honouring these men and guarding the bodies that are buried in it. But what I find is really interesting is that it says that the earth is reaching back into itself for reminders. The suggestion is that the occasional uncovering of these bodies act as reminders to us, reminders of the horrors of war, reminders maybe not to do this again, suggesting that the effects of war are incredibly long lasting, but that the earth is playing a conscious part in bringing up these bodies so that this would never happen again. The third language point I would make is this idea that the men were wasted. We see it up here in the opening stanza, the wasted young, the irony that they were told to walk, not run. We can almost see the futility or stupidity of war here. If you have to attack somebody, surely you do it as quickly as possible and not make the best target that you can by walking. And then here we've got this only now, as if the men have been silent for this long, as if they have a message for us, that's possibly to remind us of their sacrifice, to remind us about what they went through for us, but only now are they given the voice to actually talk to us as their grave is uncovered. So three language points which show the horror, the futility of war, but mark out the earth as something positive, as a sentinel guarding these bodies and using them to remind the living about the horrors that war can bring. We move to structure now, and I think it's really interesting that the poem starts with this time marker for years afterwards. Of course, he's talking about years after World War One, so we're almost going back in time there to very recently, to a time where the war is only just finished, and then the poem moves forward, even now. And then finally in this stanza we get to this morning. And we can see that the time has moved from just after World War One to now, to the present day, this morning. This time shift across the poem shows us the long-term effects of war. It's lasted from the time after World War One in the years just following it, all the way to this morning, still having an effect. It would have been 89 years later when Owen wrote his poem. 89 years after the men were buried, this battle of Mametz Wood is still affecting people, affecting the farmer who uncovered the bodies, affecting Owen and affecting us as we feel sympathy for the sacrifice that these men made. I think that the second language point I would make is look at the long sentences. I've just highlighted one here, but you can see where the full stops are, that many of the sentences are 2 stanzas in length. The frequent enjambment in here to create these long sentences makes the poem seem really thoughtful and considered, but also marks this passing time. mimics the passage of time from 1916 up to 2005, this long drawn out process where the war is still having an effect. I think the poet's message shows both his sadness at the death of these soldiers and his anger at the wasted lives, which have largely been forgotten, as so many individual battles and lives are forgotten and lost in the horror of this conflict, which took 3.5 million soldiers. He also shows us that war has these long-term effects, using the structure to show us that a war which theoretically ended in 1918 is still having an impact on the modern day, certainly up to 2005 and even into the 2020s where we are now. As for the effect on the reader, I think it's hard not to feel sympathy for the dead soldiers, and we also realise the ongoing effects of war even after 89 years when this grave was discovered, and of course now over 100. Like Dolce, some of the imagery in this poem is brutal to show the reader the realistic horrors of war. I hope this has been useful, and I'll see you for the next poem.